Bumpy's bodyguard pulled his gun and pressed it against the man's chest as the entire restaurant held its breath. Listen, because the sound that was about to come wouldn't just mean one death, it would be responsible for all the blood flowing in Harlem's streets. The man with the gun at his chest was Tommy Rossini, and he'd been talking too loud about territory that wasn't his to discuss. Bumpy Johnson sat perfectly still at the corner table, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, watching Rossini's face change from cocky to confused to absolutely terrified in the span of 3 heartbeats. The bodyguard's name was Marcus, and his finger was already taking up slack on the trigger. Every fork in Lenox Restaurant had stopped moving. Every conversation had died mid-sentence. The waitress by the kitchen door was frozen with a plate of eggs in her hand, and the cook's face was pressed against the service window like he was watching a movie he couldn't turn off. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? But here's what nobody in that restaurant knew yet. Tommy Rossini wasn't just some loud mouth trying to muscle in on Bumpy's numbers game. He was connected to people who had been planning something much bigger than a street corner shakedown. Something that involved 3 different families, 2 dirty cops, and enough money to buy half the politicians in Manhattan. Wait, because what Marcus was about to do wasn't going to solve the problem. It was going to start a war that would make the newspapers for months. Bumpy set his coffee cup down with the kind of careful precision that meant he was thinking faster than anyone else in the room. His eyes never left Rossini's face, but his voice was so quiet that only Marcus could hear him. Hold. Marcus didn't move the gun, but his finger eased off the trigger just enough to matter. Rossini was sweating now, and his breathing had gotten shallow and quick. The kind of breathing a man does when he realizes he's been playing a game where the rules just changed and nobody told him. "Tommy," Bumpy said, and his voice carried across the silent restaurant like it was a courtroom. "You want to tell me again about that conversation you had in Brooklyn last week?" Notice how Rossini's eyes shifted toward the door, then toward the windows, then back to Bumpy. He was calculating distances, counting people, trying to figure out if he had any moves left to make. The answer was no, but he hadn't figured that out yet. The thing about territory in Harlem was that it wasn't just about corners and buildings, it was about respect, and respect was measured in heartbeats. How fast yours was going when someone like Bumpy Johnson asked you a question, and how many you had left to answer. Rossini licked his lips once, twice. "I don't know what you're talking about, Bumpy. You were just sitting in Sal Marconi's back room," Bumpy interrupted, "talking about moving product through my blocks without cutting me in. You think I don't have ears in Brooklyn? Remember this moment." Because this was when Rossini realized that whatever protection he thought he had, whatever connections he'd been counting on, they weren't going to help him in Lenox Restaurant with a gun pressed against his chest and 40 witnesses watching. The waitress finally moved, setting the plate down on a nearby table with a soft clink that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. An old man by the window coughed once, and everyone in the place jumped like they'd been electrocuted. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, and Rossini felt the gun barrel press harder against his ribs. The message was clear. The only reason he was still breathing was because Bumpy Johnson hadn't said otherwise. "Yet, listen," Rossini said, and his voice cracked on the word. "Maybe there was some talk, but nothing serious. Just guys shooting the breeze, you know. No harm intended." Bumpy tilted his head slightly, like he was considering whether to believe what he'd just heard. But anyone who knew Bumpy Johnson knew he'd already made up his mind before he walked into the restaurant. The question wasn't whether Rossini was lying. It was what Bumpy was going to do about it. Look around that restaurant again. Every person in there had a story to tell after this, and those stories would spread through Harlem like wildfire. The numbers runner near the back booth would tell his cousin who worked at the barber shop. The woman with the hat would tell her church group. The teenager washing dishes in the kitchen would tell his friends on the block. Wait, because what happened next would determine whether those stories made Bumpy Johnson look stronger or whether they made him look like someone who talked big but couldn't back it up when it counted. "Marcus," Bumpy said, "step back." Marcus moved the gun away from Rossini's chest, but he didn't holster it. He just let it hang at his side, ready to bring it back up if the wrong word came out of anyone's mouth. Rossini slumped back in his chair, like someone had cut the strings holding him upright. He was still alive, which meant the conversation wasn't over. But he was smart enough to know that being alive right now didn't mean much if he said the wrong thing in the next 60 seconds. Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket, slowly so Marcus wouldn't misinterpret the movement, and pulled out a small piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully and set it on the table where Rossini could see it. "That's a list of names," Bumpy said. "People who were at Sal's place last Tuesday. People who heard you talking about my territory like it was yours to give away." Notice how Rossini's face went from scared to sick when he saw what was written on that paper. His mouth opened once, then closed without any sound coming out. The list had 8 names on it. 5 of them were connected to families that had stayed neutral in Harlem business for years. 2 of them were cops who took money to look the other way. 1 of them was a judge who owed favors to people who didn't like to be reminded about old debts. "Here's what's going to happen," Bumpy continued. "You're going to walk out of here, and you're going to call every person on that list. You're going to tell them that you made a mistake. You're going to tell them that Harlem territory stays with Harlem people, and anyone who thinks different is welcome to come talk to me about it." Remember, the gun was still in Marcus's hand, and everyone in the restaurant could see it. This wasn't a negotiation. This was Bumpy Johnson explaining how things were going to be, with 40 witnesses to make sure the message got around. Rossini nodded so fast, his neck looked like it might snap. "Yeah, absolutely. No problem. I'll make those calls today." "Before sunset," Bumpy clarified. "And Tommy, if I hear your name mentioned in Brooklyn again without my permission, Marcus won't wait for instructions." The silence stretched out for another 10 seconds, then 20. Rossini was waiting for permission to leave, but Bumpy was taking his time giving it. The longer he waited, the more scared everyone in the restaurant got, and the bigger the story would be when they told it later. Listen to what happened next, because it shows you everything you need to know about how power really works in places like Harlem. Bumpy stood up from the table, straightened his tie, and dropped $3 next to his coffee cup, enough to cover his breakfast, and a tip that would make the waitress remember him as a gentleman, not just a man who'd threatened someone in her restaurant. "Marcus," he said, "we're leaving." But before he turned toward the door, Bumpy looked around the restaurant at all the frozen faces watching him. He didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't change his expression at all. He just made sure everyone understood that they'd witnessed something important, something they'd better remember correctly when they told the story later. Wait, because Bumpy Johnson had just solved a problem without firing a shot, without spilling blood, without making headlines, but the real test would come at sunset, when those phone calls either got made or didn't. The restaurant stayed quiet for another full minute after Bumpy and Marcus walked out. Then slowly, conversations started back up. Forks began moving again. The waitress picked up her plate and continued her route to the back booth. But everyone in there knew they'd just watched something that would change how business got done in their neighborhood. Some of them would talk about it for years. Others would keep it to themselves, filing it away as the kind of information that might be useful someday. Rossini sat at his table for another 5 minutes, staring at the piece of paper Bumpy had left behind. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his wallet, and walked out without finishing his eggs or paying his check. Notice how the dynamic in the neighborhood started shifting before the sun went down. Word spread through Harlem that Tommy Rossini had tried to make moves behind Bumpy Johnson's back, and that Bumpy had handled it without violence, which somehow made him look more dangerous than if he'd just shot the man. By 6 o'clock, Rossini had made 7 of the 8 phone calls. The 8th number didn't answer. which meant he had a problem that couldn't wait until morning. Remember that judge who owed favors? His name was Harold Kessler, and he'd been avoiding phone calls all week because he knew what they were about. When Rossini finally reached him at home, their conversation lasted exactly 90 seconds. "It's done," Kessler said. "The permits you asked about won't go through. The zoning changes won't happen. Whatever you were planning for those blocks, forget about it." Look at how one conversation in a restaurant had unraveled months of planning by people who thought they were smarter than Bumpy Johnson. They'd underestimated him, and more importantly, they'd underestimated how many people in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx respected his word enough to honor it even when he wasn't in the room. The numbers runner from the restaurant told his story to 12 people before midnight. The waitress told hers to her sister, who told her husband, who worked for the sanitation department and heard things from all over the city. The teenager in the kitchen told his friends, and his friends told their friends, until the story had spread from 125th Street to 96th Street by the time most people were going to sleep. But the most important person who heard the story was a man named Vincent Torrino, who ran things for one of the families that had been planning to move into Harlem, whether Bumpy Johnson liked it or not. Wait, because when Torrino heard about what happened at Lenox Restaurant, he realized he'd been making a mistake. Not the mistake of moving into Harlem, that was still the plan. The mistake of thinking it could be done quietly. By the end of the week, 3 more meetings had been called. Not in Brooklyn, not in the Bronx, but in Manhattan, where men in expensive suits sat around polished tables and discussed how to handle the Bumpy Johnson situation before it became a bigger problem than it already was. Listen carefully to what they decided, because it would determine whether the peace in Harlem lasted another month or ended with sirens and headlines and families burying people they hadn't expected to lose. The decision was unanimous. If Bumpy Johnson wanted to play by the old rules, where territory meant something and respect was earned rather than bought, then they would remind him that the old rules worked both ways. Remember this story, because what started with one man pulling a gun in a crowded restaurant was about to become something much larger, much more dangerous, and much harder to control. The next morning, Bumpy Johnson would wake up to discover that someone had left a message for him, not on his doorstep, not at his usual haunts, but in a place that would make it clear that his enemies knew more about his movements than he'd thought possible. But before that message arrived, Bumpy had one more stop to make that night, a place where conversations happened in whispers and decisions were made that affected every street corner in Harlem. The Cotton Club was closed for renovations, but the basement was still operational for the kind of business that didn't require music or dancing. Notice how the weight of what happened at Lenox Restaurant was already shifting the balance of power by 9 o'clock that evening. Bumpy walked down the narrow staircase into the Cotton Club basement, where 5 men were waiting around a table covered with maps of Manhattan, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. These weren't street soldiers or numbers runners. These were the men who decided which blocks would be safe, which politicians would stay bought, and which families would be allowed to operate without interference. When Bumpy Johnson called a meeting in this room, people came. "Gentlemen," Bumpy said, as he took his seat at the head of the table, "we have a situation that needs addressing before it gets out of hand." Marcus stood by the door, not because anyone expected trouble, but because respect demanded that important conversations be protected from interruption. The basement had thick walls and one entrance, which meant privacy was guaranteed for as long as it took to settle business. Wait, because what Bumpy was about to tell these 5 men would change how they looked at every partnership, every agreement, every handshake deal they'd made in the past 2 years. Tommy Rossini was working for Vincent Torrino. Bumpy began. The conversation in Brooklyn wasn't just loose talk, it was reconnaissance. "They've been mapping our territory for months, figuring out which corners generate the most revenue, which cops take the biggest payments, which buildings have the most potential for conversion." Listen to how quiet that basement got when the implications of what Bumpy had just said started sinking in. Reconnaissance meant planning. Planning meant organization. Organization meant war. Unless something changed quickly. Remember the 5 men sitting around that table. James Sweet Jimmy Crawford, who controlled most of the gambling west of Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard. Robert Steady Washington, who handled union business and dock work. Michael Silk Thompson, who managed relationships with law enforcement. David the Banker Williams, who kept track of money flows and political contributions. And Samuel Church Sam Miller, who maintained connections with legitimate businesses and community leaders. Each of these men had been building their operations for years, carefully, quietly, without attracting attention from people like Vincent Torrino. Now they were learning that all their caution might not have been enough. "How deep does it go?" Sweet Jimmy asked, and his voice carried the kind of edge that suggested he was already thinking about which of his people might need to be warned or moved to safer locations. Bumpy reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a larger piece of paper. When he unfolded it on the table, it revealed a detailed diagram of Harlem's power structure, not the official one that appeared in newspapers, but the real one that determined how business actually got done. Notice how someone had drawn lines connecting their operations to potential weak points. Corrupt cops who owed money, politicians who had secrets, businessmen who depended on protection. The diagram was too detailed, too accurate to have been created by outsiders. "Someone on the inside has been talking," Bumpy said. "Someone who knows enough about our operations to create this." Wait, because the silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was each man mentally reviewing his organization, trying to figure out who could have provided this kind of information and why they would have done it. Steady Washington leaned forward to study the diagram more closely. "That information about the dock operations, only 3 people know those details. 2 of them have been with me for 15 years. The third started working for you 8 months ago," Bumpy finished. Right around the time Torino's people started asking questions about expansion opportunities. The basement felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls had moved closer together. Everyone in that room was realizing that the problem wasn't just external pressure from competing families. It was internal betrayal by people they'd trusted. Look at how Silk Thompson's face changed when he saw his own law enforcement contacts mapped out on that diagram. Some of those relationships had taken years to develop, and now they were compromised because someone with access had been sharing information with the wrong people. "We need to identify the sources," Church Sam said. "Fast, before they pass along anything else that could hurt us. Remember this moment, because what happened next would test every loyalty, every partnership, every promise that had been made in the past 5 years. Bumpy Johnson was about to ask these men to do something that went against every rule they'd learned about trust and family. "We're going to feed different information to each of our organizations," Bumpy explained. "Nothing true, nothing that could hurt us if it gets passed along, but specific enough that when it shows up in Torino's hands, we'll know exactly who's been talking." Listen to what that meant. For the next few weeks, each man would have to suspect his own people, lie to his most trusted associates, and wait to see which lies came back to bite them. Sweet Jimmy was the first to nod. "How long do we wait?" 2 weeks, Bumpy said. "Long enough for the information to travel, not long enough for them to act on it." But before anyone could agree to the plan, Marcus opened the basement door and held up his hand. Someone was coming down the stairs, and it wasn't someone who'd been invited to this meeting. Wait, because the person who walked into that basement was going to change everything they thought they knew about who could be trusted and who couldn't. The footsteps on the stairs were careful, measured, the kind of steps taken by someone who knew they were walking into a room where the wrong move could be fatal. When the figure reached the bottom and stepped into the light, every man at the table reached the same conclusion at exactly the same time. It was Detective Raymond Kelly, one of Silk Thompson's most reliable contacts in the police department, a man who'd been taking money from Harlem operations for 3 years without ever causing problems or asking uncomfortable questions. Notice how Kelly's hands were visible and empty, how he moved slowly enough that Marcus could watch every gesture. This wasn't a raid or an arrest. This was something else entirely. "Gentlemen," Kelly said, "I apologize for the interruption, but there's something you need to know before morning." Remember, Kelly wasn't supposed to know about this meeting, wasn't supposed to know about this basement, wasn't supposed to have any information about what Bumpy Johnson and these 5 men discussed when they got together. "Vincent Torrino is dead," Kelly continued. "Shot 3 times outside his social club in Brooklyn about an hour ago. Professional work, clean execution, no witnesses. Look around that basement again. Every man in there was calculating the same thing: if Torrino was dead, who had killed him, and what that meant for the war they'd been preparing to fight." "Who else knows about this?" Bumpy asked. "Nobody official yet," Kelly replied. "The body won't be discovered until tomorrow morning when the cleaning crew arrives. But word's already starting to spread through Brooklyn." Wait, because what Kelly said next was going to complicate everything they'd been planning. "There's going to be retaliation," Kelly continued. "Torrino's people think someone from Harlem ordered the hit. They're planning to move tonight, before you have a chance to prepare." Listen to what this meant. The careful strategy they'd been developing, the methodical approach to identifying internal threats and dealing with external pressure, was about to become irrelevant. If Torrino's people were coming tonight, the war was starting whether they were ready or not. Sweet Jimmy was already standing up from the table. "How many men are we talking about?" 20, maybe 25, Kelly said. "Armed, organized, and angry. They'll hit the numbers spots first, then the gambling halls, then anyone they think might have been involved in ordering Torrino's death. Remember this moment, because it was when Bumpy Johnson had to choose between protecting his operations and protecting his people. He could evacuate the key locations, minimize casualties, and let Torrino's men think they'd won the first round. Or he could stand and fight, knowing that innocent people might get hurt in the crossfire. "Marcus," Bumpy said, "how many people do we have ready to move on short notice?" 45. "Maybe 50 if we call in favors," Marcus replied. "But they're spread out across 20 blocks. It would take time to coordinate them." Notice how the balance of power had shifted again in the space of 10 minutes. An hour ago, they'd been worried about slow infiltration and careful planning. Now they were facing an immediate threat that required immediate action. "Church Sam," Bumpy continued, "how quickly can you get word to the civilian operations? Restaurants, barbershops, legitimate businesses that might get caught in the crossfire." 30 minutes, Sam replied. "Maybe less if we used the church network." But before anyone could move, Kelly held up his hand again. "There's one more thing. The person who killed Torrino. It wasn't anyone from Harlem." Wait, because what Kelly was about to reveal would change not just how they handled tonight, but how they understood everything that had been happening for the past several months. "The shooter was identified by someone who saw him leaving the scene," Kelly explained. "Carlo Benedetto. He works for the Messino family." Look at how that information hit the room. The Messino family was based in New Jersey, had no direct interests in Harlem, and no known conflicts with either Bumpy Johnson's operations or Vincent Torrino's organization. "Someone played us," Steady Washington said, and his voice carried the kind of anger that suggested he was already thinking about what needed to be done to the people responsible. "Remember, if the Messino family had killed Torrino to make it look like Harlem was responsible, then someone had orchestrated a 3-way conflict designed to eliminate competition from multiple directions. Someone with enough information to know how each family would react, enough connections to arrange the assassination, and enough patience to let the resulting war destroy their enemies for them." Listen carefully to what Bumpy Johnson said next, because it shows you exactly why he'd survived and prospered in a business where most men didn't last 5 years. "We're going to let them come," he said. "But when they get here, they're going to find something they didn't expect." The basement went quiet again. But this time, it was the kind of quiet that preceded action rather than the kind that preceded panic. Every man in that room understood that Bumpy had just shifted from defense to offense, and that whatever happened next would be remembered for years. "Kelly," Bumpy continued, "how much time do we have before Torrino's people reach Harlem?" "2 hours, maybe 3, the detective replied. "They're gathering at a warehouse in Queens, waiting for more men to arrive." "That's enough time," Bumpy said. He stood up from the table and looked at each of the 5 men who'd been planning to help him identify internal threats. "Gentlemen, we have a different problem to solve now, but the solution is going to send a message that reaches a lot further than Brooklyn." Notice how quickly the dynamic in that basement shifted from fear to anticipation. These men had been in business long enough to recognize opportunity when it presented itself, and opportunity was exactly what Bumpy Johnson had just identified. If you want to hear about the night someone tried to turn Bumpy Johnson's own people against him and how close they came to succeeding, tell me in the comments.